Lecture 18, Catullus and Horace.
Welcome to Lecture 18, in which we will begin our exploration of Roman literature by talking in particular about two extremely important lyric poets, Catullus and Horace. Now, Roman literature in general is inconceivable without Greek models. For every Greek genre that we've looked at so far, epic, drama, history, lyric poetry, there are Roman authors who modeled their own work on their Greek predecessors. We already mentioned this, of course, with comedy, with the works of Menander having been the influences on and the models for the later works of Plautus and Terence. But it was true in every other area of Roman literature as well. And to understand why this is so, we need to consider the historical and cultural relationship between Greece and Rome. So I want to start by talking about that very, very briefly, and then move on to talking about Catullus and Horace. Roman political power was on the rise during and immediately after the time when Greek political power began to wane. If you remember from the previous lecture, Greece came under Philip's domination in 338 BC, under the domination of Philip of Macedon. Rome was just coming into its own as an international power, starting very shortly after that same time period. Rome's position as a major player in the Mediterranean was solidified after a series of 3 wars with Carthage, the North African culture of Carthage. Rome and Carthage engaged in 3 wars with one another called the Punic Wars, Punic from the Latin word for Carthaginian. The first Punic War was fought in 264 through 241 BC, so that's just a few decades after Philip has taken over the control of Greece. Greece is on the wane at the same time that Rome is on the ascendancy. The second Punic War, which was the one in which Hannibal was a major player, took place in 218 through 202 BC, and the third Punic War was fought from 151 to 146 BC. With the end of the third Punic War in 146, Rome really became the unquestioned dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, including Greece itself. Rome dominated Greece itself. Now, of course, Egypt is still under the control of the Ptolemaic rulers, but Rome is in control of pretty much the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean area. Now, Roman culture, for whatever reason, we can't explore what the reasons might be in this lecture, had very few indigenous art forms or indigenous forms of literature. And instead of developing its own traditions, Rome derived a great deal of its art, its literature, and its mythology from Greece, directly from Greece. Rome borrowed Greek cultural forms and Greek mythological stories. Most important for our purposes, Roman literature followed Greek models very, very directly. Roman poets, when they set out to write epic, wrote in dactylic hexameter, even though that didn't work quite as well in Latin or quite as fluently in Latin as it did in Greek. Roman historians modeled themselves, as we'll see later, on Herodotus and Thucydides. And in this lecture, we'll talk about how Roman lyric poets modeled themselves specifically on Callimachus to a large extent, and on earlier lyric poets as well. Now, in general, Roman attitudes towards Greece and Greek culture were highly ambivalent. Greek culture was admired for its antiquity and its sophistication, but at the same time it was distrusted and sort of looked down upon all at once. According to legend, Romulus had founded Rome in 753 BC, so the Romans considered themselves a much newer people than the Greeks. The Greeks had been there as far back as mythic memory could reach. They were already major players in the Trojan War in the 12th century. In contrast, the Romans believed that their own culture began in 753 when Romulus founded Rome. So they were a newer people than the Greeks, and to some extent this helped justify their cultural borrowings. Why reinvent the wheel? Why come up with forms of literature from scratch when there are already these fully developed forms, epic, drama, history, lyric, and so forth, waiting to be borrowed from Greece? So on the one hand, Greek culture and the Greeks were looked up to as cultural models by the Romans, but at the same time, the Romans, or at least some Romans, tended to view Greek culture with suspicion. The Greeks were seen as tricky, overly crafty, overly sophisticated, a bit decadent. They were viewed with a certain degree of suspicion and even maybe a bit of contempt. And this was particularly true of one strand in Roman thought, in Roman culture, which admired, or at least claimed to admire, plain living, plain speaking, the avoidance of luxury, the avoidance of softness as hallmarks of sterling character. So from this viewpoint, if you take that idea of what makes a good Roman, that it's someone who speaks the plain truth, who lives a life free of luxury and of over-sophistication, think how the Hellenistic culture, the highly refined, learned, erudite Greek culture that we were talking about in the last lecture, as exemplified, for instance, by the poetry of Callimachus, think how that would appear to someone who admires plain speaking and plain living. It would be particularly repellent. It would summarize everything that seemed to be wrong with an over-sophisticated, over-stylized culture. But, of course, conversely, those people within Roman culture who rejected the idea of plain, simple speaking and living might be particularly drawn to Hellenistic culture, to Hellenistic models, as a kind of contrast to what they were seeing in their own culture being held up as an ideal. And in fact, in the mid-1st century BC in Rome, we find a group of young men who began to write poetry modeled very closely on the works of Callimachus and other Alexandrian poets. This group of young poets in 1st century BC Rome is often called the Neoterics or the Poetae Novi. Those are terms used for these groups. They mean new poets or almost newfangled poets. These are terms used for this group of poets by Cicero, who did not mean to be complimentary in this terminology, but modern scholars have tended to adopt it and to talk about the Neoterics. The Neoterics took over Callimachus's ideas about what makes great poetry with a great deal of enthusiasm. They wrote short, carefully polished, highly learned, highly elusive poems using arcane and sophisticated references to works of previous literature, to mythological exempla, the more obscure the better. To give you one example, when Catullus, whom I'll be focusing on in just a moment, wants to refer to Heracles in one of his poems, he doesn't say Heracles. He says falsi parens Amphitrioniades, which means the false-parented son of Amphitryon. You have to know that Heracles was the son of Zeus and a human mother, and that Alcmene, Heracles' mother, was married to a man named Amphitryon. Thus, Heracles is the false-parented son of Amphitryon, and that's what you call him in your poem. It's too simple to say Heracles. The idea is to be as elusive, as highly learned, as obscure as possible. The Neoterics adapted Greek poetic meters to the Latin language, drawing not just on Callimachus, but on earlier Greek lyric poets as well, and they saw themselves as the heirs of Callimachus and other Alexandrian poets. Now, our knowledge of most of the Neoterics is based on very, very scanty fragments, and several of them are no more than names to us. There are several of whom we know only their names and nothing else. But the perhaps complete works of one poet, Catullus, have survived. His book may be a bit damaged, but we think we have at least almost everything that he wrote. He was probably born in 84 BC and probably died soon after 54. The latest absolutely securely datable event that he mentions in his work occurred in 55 BC. We're told that he was 30 when he died, so we assume his dates are probably around 84 to around 54, though we're not certain of that. He was from Verona, but apparently spent most of his adult life in Rome, and his poems range from extraordinarily beautiful romantic love lyrics through harshly obscene invective, from intensely personal to directly political. His work was profoundly influential on the next generations of Latin poets, including Horace, Propertius, Tibullus, even Virgil and Ovid, as well as on later European poetry. Catullus's admiration for and adherence to Callimachian models is obvious throughout his work from the introductory poem of his collection on. The very first poem in his book, which introduces the work, demonstrates several typical features of the Neoteric style. It's short. The poem is only 10 lines long. It's highly polished, very carefully crafted, very witty. And the first 2 lines of this poem Catullus uses vocabulary that carefully lays out his poetic program and signals his homage to Callimachus. The first two lines are, cui dono lepidum novum libellum arida modopumic expolitum, to whom do I give this charming new little book just now polished up with dry pumice stone. Now, the book is charming. Lepidum, think of Callimachus saying that a poem should be slender, should be charming, should not be overdone, overbloated. The book is little, it's polished. And the Latin metaphor is more immediate than our metaphor when we call a work polished. In Latin, to smooth papyrus before writing on it, you quite literally polished it with pumice stone. So the metaphor is more direct, but the idea is the same. A polished work is a carefully crafted, carefully taken care of, deliberately looked after work. So Catullus's book, he tells us, is charming and is polished. As it's come down to us, it contains three main sections: short poems in a variety of meters, then a central section of longer poems running to 150 or so lines apiece, and then a third section, a concluding section of short poems in a meter called elegiac couplets. Within these three sections, Catullus covers a wide range of subjects and a variety of tones. And there are several groups of poems that scholars call cycles of poems, that are scattered throughout the work, but that address, each one of these cycles will address the same subject or feature the same people in different parts of the collection. The most famous of these cycles, and the most important for our purposes in this lecture, is the group of poems that Catullus writes to and about a woman whom he calls Lesbia. They're scattered throughout the collection. They show up in all three parts of the work. The Lesbia poems are remarkable and noteworthy in many ways. First of all, they reflect a range of emotions and tones, from absolutely lyrical romanticism, how many kisses of yours would be enough for me, as many as the stars in the sky, that kind of thing, all the way through to bitter despair. In all of them, Catullus manages, through the use of intricate meter and very careful crafting, to adopt a tone that sounds immediate and personal. The same sort of thing we talked about with Sappho, Catullus does to an even greater degree. He sounds as though he's pouring out immediate, personal, heartfelt emotion, but he does it in extremely intricate meter with careful word placing, careful use of alliteration and assonance, and yet his presentation of heartfelt emotion is so persuasive that many critics, particularly in the 19th century, took these poems utterly at face value, thought that Lesbia was cruel to Catullus. He dashed back home and dashed off one of these poems without even stopping to think about it, that it was a direct outpouring of emotion. Now, most modern critics don't think that, but that is how the poems read. The name Lesbia is clearly meant to recall Sappho. Remember, Sappho was the poet from Lesbos. By using the name Lesbia, which means woman from Lesbos in Latin, Catullus is clearly intending to compliment the woman he addresses with that name upon her erudition and her sophistication. You are as learned and as creative and as skillful and as totally amazing as Sappho, is what's wrapped up in that name. Poem 51, where Catullus addresses a woman by this name, is written in Sapphic meter, the same meter of the poem by Sappho that I read to you several lectures ago, and it's also a free translation of one of Sappho's poems, a poem describing the sensation of watching your beloved across the room talking to somebody else. Sappho and Catullus in his free translation say things like, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth, I'm covered with sweat, my ears are ringing, my eyes are darkening when I see somebody else talking to you and enjoying your conversation, and I'm standing across the room watching. Now, many scholars would assume that poem 51, that is the 51st poem in the collection as we have it, was the first poem that Catullus wrote to Lesbia. It would be a great way to introduce himself, or to give this woman an idea that he was in love with her. It's a translation of a poem by Sappho. He sends it to her because he knows she's learned enough to appreciate it. If she wants to take it as a personal address to her, she can. If she doesn't want to, well, it's just a translation of a poem by Sappho. So We don't know what chronology, in what order Catullus wrote these poems, but many scholars assume poem 51 is the first in the Lesbia cycle. As the poems appear in the text itself, they're not in anything like chronological order. They bounce around from happiness to despair in clearly unchronological style. As the cycle continues, as the Lesbia cycle continues, it becomes clear that Lesbia is a married woman and that Catullus is only one of many lovers whom she has. And his poems to her run the whole gamut of the emotions one might feel in that situation, from poems in which Catullus assures himself that he really doesn't mind Lesbia's infidelity because he knows she loves him best, to ones where he presents their love as an emotional bond analogous to the strongest ties of the Roman family, to the love that a father might feel for a son, and says that Lesbia has betrayed that bond, to ones in which he denounces her as utterly promiscuous and completely unworthy of his love. So you get the whole picture of this kind of love affair. And the picture Catullus paints of a young man's progress from romantic love to bitter hatred is so very compelling that it's almost irresistible to ask, so who was she anyway? Since AD 158, the answer to that question has been Clodia. Apuleius tells us, he's an author we'll meet in a later lecture, tells us that when Catullus wrote Lesbia, he meant Clodia. And the two names are metrically equivalent. She, reading the poems herself, could take the name Lesbia out, put the name Clodia in, and the meter would still work. Now, unfortunately, we know of 3 women who lived at the same time as Catullus, named Clodia. 3 sisters, each of them had the family name Clodia, and the evidence is not sufficient to tell us which one of the 3 Catullus meant. The usual identification is with Clodia Metelli, Clodia who was married to a man named Metellus, but this may be due to the chance fact that we know more about her than we know about her sisters, for the reason that one of Cicero's speeches has survived, in which Cicero denounces Clodia Metelli as a promiscuous woman who specializes in taking younger lovers, a married woman who is unfaithful to her husband over and over again with younger men. Now, if we knew as much about Clodia Metelli's 2 sisters as we know about her, we might think that one of them fits Catullus's Clodia, Catullus's Lesbia better. There are some chronological problems, particularly with the date when Clodia Metelli was widowed, that make that identification not entirely secure. But in any case, most scholars accept that Lesbia is in fact a pseudonym for a genuine woman, that she's not merely and entirely a fiction that Catullus invented for the sake of his poetry. In the Lesbia poems, whoever she was and whatever his motivation for writing them, Catullus laid the groundwork for a whole genre of Latin poetry, which scholars call love elegy, in which the poet adopts a persona, presents himself as suffering greatly at the hands of a cruel mistress, domina is the word in Latin, who makes him suffer terrible emotional torments. Now, when I say mistress, the word domina in Latin means quite literally mistress in the sense of female owner of a slave. And in a slave-holding society, as Roman culture was, this would be a very powerful metaphor. The poet is saying, I am in the control of this woman I'm in love with, the same way a slave is in the control of his domina, of his owner, his mistress. In the next generation of poets, in the hands of Propertius, Tibullus, and Ovid, love elegy became one of the foremost genres of Latin poetry, and its influence on later European poetry is profound. So Catullus's Lesbia is the ultimate ancestress of Dante's Beatrice, Petrarch's Laura, and Shakespeare's Dark Lady of the Sonnets. The Lesbia poems were only one aspect of Catullus's work. He also wrote short poems on political subjects, on friendship, his love for his home, many other topics. His handling of Greek lyric meters and his use of short, self-contained poems undoubtedly had a great deal of influence on the greatest Latin lyric poet of all, Horace. And I'll turn to Horace, some background material on him, and then looking at his poetic achievement at this point. Quintus Horatius Flaccus, or Horace, as we call him in English, was born on December 8th, 65 BC, and died on November 27th, 8 BC. As those precise dates indicate, We know much more about his life than we know about Catullus's life, partly because he included many biographical details in his own poetry, but also because an ancient biography of Horace by Suetonius has survived, so we know much more about him. Horace was born in Venusia. His father was a freedman, that is, a man who had been born a slave but set free during his life, and yet Horace's freedman father managed to provide for his son an education that would normally have been given to an upper-class Roman youth. Horace studied first in Rome and then in Athens. This makes it quite clear that his parents recognized his abilities and had ambitions for their extraordinarily talented son. However, these ambitions almost came to nothing, because Horace's family was on the wrong side in the civil wars after the assassination of Julius Caesar. They lost all their possessions, and Horace was lucky not to have lost his life. The crisis brought on by Caesar's assassination in 44 BC was the culmination of decades of social upheaval. After Caesar's death, there was an open power struggle for many years. At first, Caesar's trusted friend Mark Antony and Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, Octavian, later to be known as Augustus, banded together to fight against Brutus and Cassius, the ringleaders of the assassins of Caesar. Horace and his family made the mistake of siding with Brutus. In fact, Horace fought in Brutus's army. After Mark Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian began to struggle with one another for leadership. It became fairly clear that the upshot was going to be one-man rule. The question was just which one man it would be. Mark Antony became involved with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Yes, the last of the Ptolemies, the same Cleopatra I was talking about in the previous lecture. And many Romans feared that the two of them, Antony and Cleopatra, were planning to form a joint empire, joining Rome and Egypt together under their rulership as king and queen, or emperor and empress. Finally, in 31 BC, Octavian defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, thus, though he did not know it, ending the Hellenistic Age, as we talked about in the previous lecture. With his victory at Actium, Octavian became the all but acknowledged sole ruler of Rome, and he remained so until his death in AD 14. In 27 BC, he was awarded the title Augustus, which means the revered one, but which came to function as his name. Now, modern historians refer to Augustus as the first Roman emperor, but Augustus himself was scrupulous about never using any terms of kingship. He did not say, "I am king of Rome." What he said was, "I have restored Roman government to its old-fashioned republican form." He was very, very careful not to say that he was a one-man ruler, but rather to say that he had brought back the good old days of republican government. He was also a patron of the arts, of cultural matters, and the arts, including poetry. Now, Augustus's patronage of poets wasn't direct. In other words, he did not go out and hire a poet himself and give the man money to write poetry. Rather, Augustus worked through his friend Maecenas, an extremely rich man who provided financial support for various poets and served as the link between those poets and Augustus. Horace, despite his support of Brutus, despite the fact that he had fought against Octavian, later Augustus, Horace was lucky enough to become one of Maecenas' proteges. This was probably in large part because of the influence of Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, whom we'll talk about in the next lecture, who introduced Horace to Maecenas. However it came about, Maecenas' patronage gave Horace the resources and the security he needed to enjoy 3 decades of working life as a poet. Among other things, Maecenas gave Horace a farm, gave him a place to live, a means of living, sustenance, enough to live on, and so Horace could dedicate himself to writing poetry, which he did. His output includes a book of epodes, 2 books of satires, and 2 books of epistles. But Horace's most famous poems, and the ones that have had the most influence on later poetry, are his 4 books of odes. The odes are a collection of lyric poems in a variety of meters, all of the meters adapted from Greek lyric poetry. They include love lyrics to various different addressees, political statements, vignettes of daily life. Unlike Catullus, in all of the odes, Horace adopts a tone that is detached and often wryly amused. He doesn't present himself as in the throes of deep passion or deep emotion. He never expresses the depths of either joy or despair that we see in Catullus's amatory poetry. But within his controlled and mannered persona, Horace achieves great lyrical beauty and extraordinarily memorable poetry. And in terms of their form, the odes are a tour de force. Horace adapts Greek meters to Latin poetry with an astonishing versatility and success. Now, Catullus had done this already, as I mentioned. Poem 51, in which Catullus translates Sappho, is written in Sapphic meter. But Horace perfects the process, and the odes show an astonishing facility with meter, word choice, and word placement, which unfortunately makes them fundamentally untranslatable, particularly into a language such as English, which is a non-inflected language. By that I mean very briefly that in English, meaning is expressed by word order. The dog bit the cat and the cat bit the dog mean two entirely different things because of word order. Latin is an inflected language where the words change form depending on whether they're subject or object in the sentence and for their other uses in the sentence. And that means that Latin word order is enormously flexible, and Horace uses this to great effect in his poems. The opening lines of one of his most famous poems, Book 1, Poem 5, often called the Pyrrha Ode, gives some idea of his technique. A literal translation of the first three lines of this poem would read, Pyrrha, what graceful boy, drenched in liquid fragrances, urges you among many roses in a pleasant cave? But the Latin word order is, what many graceful you, boy among roses, drenched liquid urges, fragrances pleasant, Pyrrha in cave. The word order of the first line, quis multa gracilis te puerin rosa, mimics what it's describing. The word te, which means you, referring to Pyrrha, is at the center of the line, surrounded by the words, just as Pyrrha herself is being embraced by the boy. You cannot get that effect in English. That's what I mean by saying it's fundamentally untranslatable. However, no less a poet than John Milton tried. And Milton, in his translation, tries to preserve both the Latin meter and the word order as much as possible. Milton writes for this poem, what slender youth bedewed with liquid odors courts thee on roses in some pleasant cave? Pyrrha, for whom bind'st thou in wreaths thy golden hair, plain in thy neatness? Oh, how oft shall he on faith and changed gods complain, and seas rough with black winds and storms unwanted shall admire, who now enjoys thee credulous, all gold, who always vacant, always amiable, hopes thee, of flattering gales unmindful. Hapless they, to whom thou untried seem'st fair. Me and my vowed picture the sacred wall declares to have hung my dank and dropping weeds to the stern god of sea. Now, Milton's attempt to preserve the Latin word order means that his English is very hard to follow unless you have the Latin in front of you. David Ferry, a modern poet, has done a very, very different version. A comparison of the two, I think, helps you see the problems with translating Horace. Ferry's version of Ode 1.5 is, what perfumed debonair youth is it among the blossoming roses, urging himself upon you in the summer grotto? For whom have you arranged your shining hair so elegantly and simply? How often will he weep because of betrayal, and weep because of the fickleness of the gods, wondering at the way the darkening wind suddenly disturbs the calm waters? Now he delights in thinking how lovely you are, vacant of storm as the fragrant air in the garden, not knowing at all how quickly the wind can change. Hapless are they enamored of that beauty which is untested yet, and as for me, the votive tablet on the temple wall is witness that in tribute to the god I have hung up my sea-soaked garment there. Milton's and Ferry's translation give you some indication of just how difficult it is to translate Horace. They're working with the same poem. They come up with very, very different approaches, different word choice, different word placement. But despite the difficulty of translating Horace, no other lyric poet of antiquity has had so strong an influence on English poetry during the Renaissance and the neoclassical age. Impossible though a true translation of Horace may be, not only Milton and Ferry, but Wyatt, Dryden, Pope, and countless other English poets were irresistibly drawn to try. So this lecture has begun our look at Roman literature through talking about Catullus and Horace. In the next lecture, we will turn to Roman epic and talk about Virgil and his great foundational epic for Rome, the Aeneid.